Hey everyone, and welcome to the Apple basket insert for our basket subscription. There's a couple colors we're going to be using today. It's Honky Tonk Red, Barn Red, Kudzu, Daisy, Chocolate, and of course you're going to need your glue, some brushes, a sponge if you want to, water, scissors, and a paint palette. These are your pieces that you're going to be painting. The two half apples that I just put off to the side you will not be painting. The rest of these pieces you will be painting. This one is going to go in the back. We're going to be starting with the Honky Tonk Red first. Just a little bit goes a long way. These are small apples. I prefer to use a sponge, just a makeup wedge sponge. Put a little bit of paint on your sponge, and then pick which apples you're going to do with the Honky Tonk Red. Dab straight up and down. Trying to avoid the stem and the leaf area because those are going to be painted different colors. The main thing here is just to choose which apples you want to paint with the Honky Tonk Red. Once you finish painting all of the apples that you want with the Honky Tonk Red, kind of line everything up to see how it's going to look. And make sure you have the colors where you want them to be. Once I'm done with the Honky Tonk Red, I'm going to go through with some Barn Red. I'm still going to use that same Honky Tonk Red sponge. And I'm just going to go straight onto my apples, being very, very careful not to go onto the apple next to it. If you prefer to use brushes, that's entirely possible too. I've learned how to work with the sponges, so I prefer to use sponges. Sponges work great when you're blending colors. It's a little bit easier to do than it is with brushes, for me at least. Once I finish painting all of the apples that I want to do with the Barn Red, we're going to use the same sponge. We're going to dip half of the sponge into the Barn Red and then half of it back into the Honky Tonk Red. And we're going to create what I call as a split sponge. With our split sponge, we're going to dab off the excess paint and blend those colors in the center so you get a nice seamless ombre effect. Now that I have both colors onto my sponge, I'm just going to use the Barn Red to highlight my Honky Tonk Red apples. So what I'm doing is I am making sure that the Honky Tonk Red is facing inwards, and I'm just using the Barn Red on the edges. I'm going to go back through with a little bit more Barn Red. Blend off the excess, and then just use it on the edges. So what happens here is the Honky Tonk Red is going to lay right on top of the existing base coat of Honky Tonk Red, so you're not going to see that. And it's going to give you a nice blended edge. So for my Barn Red apples, my darker apples, I'm going to go through with the Honky Tonk and just do the opposite. So I'm going to use the Honky Tonk Red as the highlighting on my Barn Red apples. So same idea, just doing the opposite. So I'm going to make sure that the Barn Red is sticking on the outside. The Barn Red is sticking on the inside. The Honky Tonk is on the outside. Just giving a little bit of highlighting to my dark red apples. Giving it a little bit of a two-tone effect. Two different shades of red. Giving it some dimension. Doing the same thing down here on this other Barn Red apple. Just using the Honky Tonk to give it some highlighting. And losing my camera there, so hold on while I reposition it. Got a little crazy on me. Now that I am finished with my reds, I'm going to move on to my daisy. I'm going to use the same sponge that still has red on it, and I'm going to put a little bit of daisy on half of it. I'm going to dab it off and kind of blend those two colors together. A little bit of the honky tonk red. Blend those two colors together on my sponge. And I'm going to use that for highlighting a different apple. So this other apple here that I had originally done with the honky tonk red, I'm just going to add a little bit of daisy to it. Not all apples are perfectly red. This one's going to have a little bit of yellow shading to it. Just blending in a little bit on that edge. Daisy on the outside edge, honky tonk on the inside. Take a look and see how it looks. Try to blend it out a little bit more. Make it look a little bit more natural. Going right back into where I did my original blending, make sure my sponge is still facing the correct way. I'm just going to add a little bit more yellow to that edge. Once I finish blending out a little bit of that yellow onto that apple, giving it some highlight, I'm going to move on to my next colors, and I don't want red on these colors. I'm going to go ahead and take my scissors and cut the end off of my sponge, giving me a nice clean sponge to start for the next set of colors. I'm going to start with some green. Do a couple green apples. This green is the kudzu green, so it's one of the lighter greens. You can always use a different shade of green if you prefer. Your kit will come with the kudzu though. I'm going to add some green onto this last apple that's going on the back side. Technically, you wouldn't have to paint all the way down to the bottom of the apple because half of it will be covered. I like to paint it all just to be sure that I don't have any natural wood showing through, just in case. Again, keeping clear of the stem and the leaf. We're going to be painting those a different color. Once I finish painting my green apples, I'm going to use the same green sponge. I'm going to go dip half of it into my barn red, and then the other half back into the kudzu again. I'm running out of space in the middle of my palette, but as long as the paint's not too wet, you can go right over top of the existing paint that's there. Just going to use some of the barn red to give a highlight to my green apple. Blending as best as I can until I get the look that I want. This one I'm going a little bit further into the apple instead of just on the edge. Got a little bit of a harsh line with my barn red, so I'm going back through with the green side of my sponge to blend it out. Making my apples look a little bit more organic. My next apple I'm going to do, I want yellow, so I wanted to cut off the red. I didn't want any accidental red. So we're going to do half with the green and half with the yellow. Again, sponging off. Make sure you get that nice blending in the center of your sponge. Once your sponge is blended, you can go ahead and put it right on the one side of your apple. It's up to you which side of the apples you want to do. I typically just always go to the left-hand side, but you can always do your coloring on your right-hand side instead. So here I'm just blending a little bit of yellow onto my green apple. Refilling my sponge, dabbing it off. When it comes to blending, less is more. So the less paint you have on your sponge, the easier it is to control. If you have a really globby amount of paint on your sponge, it's going to be hard to blend it. But you also don't want a dry sponge. A dry sponge will leave weird marks behind. So you kind of need a nice damp sponge, but not too much paint on it. Going ahead and just placing my apples to see how they look, to see what color I want to paint my last apple. If you paint an apple the wrong color, the nice thing about this is that it's paint. Once the paint is dry, 9 times out of 10 you can always paint over top of it with a different color. Getting a look to see how my apples are starting to look. I'm trying to decide what color to do for that last apple. I have a lot of red in there, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to take my sponge and go straight into the yellow. I'm not going to care so much if there's a little bit of green on my apple. Some yellow apples just have a little bit of green to them. So I'm using my dirty green and yellow sponge to create a nice yellow-green type kind of apple. With using a dirty sponge, I'm kind of naturally getting highlighting in there. It's already got a little bit of green and a little bit of yellow. Just going to use a little bit of water to blend out any spots that didn't look quite right, getting close to that red apple without going over top. A nice damp brush will blend out the paint colors. Now that I've finished painting all of my apples, I'm going to go through and I'm going to paint the leaves with the same kudzu green, using just a very narrow brush. Not worrying about painting the apples that have the laser lines on them. Those will get covered with the apples that will get glued to the front of those. Next, we're going to be using the same little brush. We're going to use some chocolate and we're just going to paint the stems with that. Again, not worrying about the apples that had the laser lines on them, as those pieces are going to get covered. Next, we're going to be painting the tag, the little Farm Fresh tag that goes with it. The easiest way to paint this so that you don't get paint inside of the letters is to use a sponge. I'm just grabbing a little bit of green and a little bit of yellow, putting both of them on my sponge, dabbing off the excess, trying to create a lighter green. Just dab straight up and down. As long as you don't have too much paint on your sponge, the letters won't get filled in. Less is more. If you need to do a second coat, it's better to do a second coat than to put too much paint on your sponge. If you have too much paint on your sponge, it's going to fill in the lettering. Going in with a little bit of yellow. And I'm just going to put a little bit on the edges, just to give it a little bit of contrast. Blending off a little bit of that harsh yellow that I have there. Just putting a little bit of yellow over top of the whole thing, just to make it a shade of green and just a smidge of yellow on it. Using just a damp brush again, I'm going to soften those edges with a little bit of water, just to blend in that yellow a little bit more. Being careful not to get the paint inside the lettering. Once you get paint inside the lettering, you're not going to be able to get it back out again. Now that I've painted all of my apples, they're ready for some decoration. Once your paint is dry, you can use some of the paint pens to add a little bit of accent lines onto the apples. For this particular project, I am using the fine white paint pen, and I'm just adding some accent lines and some dots to the leaves, the apples, and the stems. So as you can see, I have a little bit of oopsie here. I went ahead and I had glued my apples to the front of that front piece of my apples, and I forgot to put in the spacers. So I had to peel my apples off, and we are going to sit here and we're going to redo it. So on the parts that you did not paint, we're going to put little dabs of glue on it, and we're going to add on to those half apples that didn't get painted. Make sure you're putting the right apple in the correct spot before you glue it down. Everything's lined up so that the pieces are flush with each other. Once you have your spacers put in there, you can go ahead and add a little bit of glue to the fronts of them. And you're going to add your apples right to the front as well. Make sure everything is setting and nothing is sliding. If something slides, then it might not fit well into your basket. Making sure everything is lined up flush so you don't see any wood. Holding that piece down while I go ahead and put the other apple to the other side. And with the joys of video editing, here you can see that I had already glued my apples on, and there are my two spacer pieces sitting right up at the top corner of my screen. But this part of the video is going to show you where to put the glue for the back section of apples. So you're just going to do a couple little dots of glue on the bottom side of the fronts of those apples. And then you're going to place it behind the apples that go in the front. Make sure that it is up high enough that when you put your apples into your basket, it's not going to impede it from going down into your basket. And just hold it there. If you have the Gorilla Glue, it'll set in a couple seconds. So you're just going to put a little pressure on it and make sure everything's holding. And I'm just going to go and add in a few more extra of the accent lines now that I see where my apples are placed. Giving a little bit of curvature where the stem is, just to give it a little bit of a highlight there. You can always use the black pen to do some highlighting instead. It's up to you, a personal preference. That is what your apples are going to look like, and just don't forget to put those spacers that are in the top right corner onto your apples before you put on those big apples on the front. And you have a back tab that needs to get glued on with your Gorilla Glue. You can either put it on either side or you can split the difference. Once you have that on, your project is done. Thanks for joining me. Can't wait to see you next month.